Okay, hey everybody. So this video is lesson 6.2 about genes, alleles, and traits. The things that I want you to know before you go today are number 1, what is meiosis? 2, what are alleles? 3, what does homozygous mean? What does heterozygous mean? And 4, how to use a Punnett Square to predict traits in offspring. So where we left off in the last video was a recap of how DNA affects proteins, which affect traits. And we're going to expand on that. But before we do that, I want to talk first about what is meiosis, because it's important that you understand what meiosis is before continuing. Okay, so we've been talking about mitosis with the T, and that's where one cell, one parent cell, just makes an exact copy of itself to make two daughter cells that are exactly like the parent cell. That's mitosis, okay? Meiosis is a little bit different. So in meiosis, you start off with the parent cell, which has 46 chromosomes. Remember, 46 chromosomes is one full set of DNA. So one full set of DNA equals 46, okay, chromosomes. So in meiosis, what you end up with, you start off with one cell that has 46 chromosomes, and you end up with 4 cells that have 23 each. And the way that that happens is actually it's a 2-step process. Meiosis 1, meiosis 2. Pretty easy to remember, right? Step 1 to meiosis is meiosis 1, step 2 is meiosis 2. In step 1, we go from 146 to 246s. And in step 2, we go from 246s to 423s. Okay? And what we end up with are what we call 4 haploid cells. Haploid cells. Or you might see it notated as a lowercase n. What you start with is a diploid cell, which you might see notated as 2n. Okay? So 46 is diploid, 2n, and haploid is 23, or just n, just one n. Okay? So that's meiosis. Now, what cells in your body do this? The only cells in your body that do this are your reproductive cells, your sperm cells, and your egg cells, okay? The sperm and egg are the only cells that do this. Every other cell does mitosis, where the babies end up being just like the parents. Only in meiosis, sperm and egg cells, or the babies, have half the amount, because the sperm has 23 and the egg has 23. When they join together, the baby will have 46, which is one full amount of DNA. Okay, so that's meiosis. Now, moving on. So when your body makes sperm and eggs, the sperm and eggs will each have half of your DNA, half the mom, half the dad. Those two halves come together, they make the whole, the baby. Now, before we do that, let's remember that the traits of the baby are controlled by, we're going to start at the end and work our way backwards. The traits are controlled by what proteins your body has. The proteins that your body has are determined by which amino acids your body makes and in what order they put them in. The way that your body knows which amino acids to make and in what order to put them in is determined by instructions on which ones to make and in which order to put them in that are in what we call messenger RNA, mRNA for short. But how does mRNA know the instructions on which amino acids to put and in which order to make that protein so that you can have that trait? Well, The original set of instructions comes from, they get these instructions from the original set of instruction holder, which is DNA, right? Now, what is DNA? DNA is 46 of these chromosomes. So let's say this is one chromosome. Remember, a full set of DNA is 46. So your DNA is actually 46 chromosomes that all float around each other inside the nucleus. Now, again, I'm just going to write chromosome here. Okay. Now, chromosomes, we've been talking a lot about genes lately, and just so you remember, genes are just sections of these chromosomes. So maybe this section between here and here is gene number 1. And maybe this section from there to the end is gene number 2. Now in reality, chromosomes have a lot more genes than just 2, okay? But we're just keeping it simple. So let's say that gene 1 controls a trait. Every gene controls a trait. So let's say gene 1 controls height. And let's say that gene 2 controls hair color. Okay? So these are the traits that are controlled by these genes that are located on this chromosome, which is one of 46 chromosomes inside of every cell that collectively we refer to as your DNA, which codes for your mRNA, which codes for your amino acids, which codes for your proteins, which codes for your traits. Okay. Now, but just notice that these traits, you can have variations of these traits. There's not just a height gene. You could be tall, you could be short, you could be somewhere in between. Hair color, same thing. There's a lot of different variations of hair color. You could be brown, blonde, red, different variations everywhere in between. Black hair, everywhere in between, okay? So there's variations of these traits. And so let's say that there's only, just to keep it simple, again, to keep it very simple, in reality it's more complex, but let's say that height, you have a tall gene or a tall version and short. So in this hypothetical world, you can be either tall or short, okay? And let's say hair color, the variations of hair color, let's say that you can only have one of 2 hair colors, again, to keep it simple. So let's say that capital B is brown and lowercase b is blonde. Okay? So each of these variations of a trait, tall, short, brown, blonde, these variations are what we call alleles. Okay? So alleles are just variations of the traits. Now, you'll notice that some of these alleles are capital, like big B and big T, brown and tall, and some of these alleles are lowercase, little b and little t. That's because alleles can be what we call dominant or recessive. So dominant is the capital, like big B and big T. Recessive are the lowercase, which are like little b and little t. Okay? Now what's the difference? Well, when there's a dominant present, it's going to be the dominant one. If you have a dominant allele, the dominant allele gets expressed every time. If you have a lowercase allele, it only gets expressed, or a recessive allele, it only gets expressed if there's no dominant allele to cover it up. And you're probably wondering, well, why would I have more than one allele? You do. You have multiple alleles for every trait. Let me explain, okay? So, you can be big B, little b, or you can be big B, or you can be little b. You have at least 2 alleles for each trait because you have 2 parents, and you get at least one. Some traits you get more than just 2 alleles, okay? Most traits you actually do. But once again, to keep it simple, you get at least 1 allele from each parent. So you have at least 2 for every trait. So for hair color, you have maybe you got brown from your dad and you got blonde from your mom. So you have those 2, brown and blonde, big B and little b. Well, if you have big B and little b, then you're going to have brown hair because brown hair is dominant. So because you have a big B, it's going to get expressed every time. The only way you would be blonde is if there's if there's no big B to drown out the little b. So if all you have is little b, of course you're going to be little b, which is blonde. So if you get a little b from dad and a little b from mom, then you have little b, and you're going to be blonde because there's no brown allele to drown out the blonde, okay? So when you have big B, or little b, this is what's called homozygous. So you have homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. Or let's say you get a big B from dad and a little b from mom, and you would be what we call heterozygous. Okay. I know this is getting sloppy. I'm gonna clear this out. So once again, let's say that big B, little b is dad, and let's say that mom has big B, little b as well. Okay. So remember, big B is brown hair, little b is blonde hair. Actually, let me give more of a space between here, okay? So this is mom, and this is dad. And you can actually calculate the percent chance that their kids will have either brown hair or blonde hair using what's called a Punnett Square. And that's what this is. This is the Punnett Square right here, okay? So using a Punnett Square, we can take mom, and let's say that we know what their alleles are. We'd have to look at their genetics to really know, but let's just assume that we know for sure that mom is big B, little b. Her 2 alleles for hair color are big B and little b. Maybe she got a big B from her mom, your grandma, and a little b from her dad, your granddad, and that's why she is big B, little b. And maybe your dad, same thing. He's big B, little b as well. Put that further down. Okay, so what you do is just like a times table when you learned your times table in math. You just take big B, put them together. Big B, little b. Big B, little b. You always write the capital first. I could have written little b, big B, but that doesn't make any sense. You always write capital first. Just trust me, just do it, okay? And this one is little b, okay? All right, so these are all the possible outcomes. If mom and dad have a kid, these are the possible outcomes that the baby could be. The baby could be either big B, it could be big B, little b. This is big B, little b, but I already wrote it, so I don't have to write it again over here. And this is little b. So there's 3 combinations or 3 possibilities of different combinations that the kids could be. And the way that you do the math to find out, you're going to need to be able to do the math to find out exactly what the chances are that the kids will be each of these three, okay? So what's the percent chance that the child will be big B, big B? Well, let's see, there's 4 squares. Only one of them is big B, big B. So that's a 1 in 4 chance, or 25%. What about big B, little b? There's 1 there and 1 there, so that's 2 out of the 4. So 2 out of 4, that's 50%. And little b, there's just 1. 1 out of the 1, 2, 3, 4 is little b. And so there's a 25% chance that the offspring or the kids will have blonde hair. So this is what's called a monohybrid. A monohybrid cross. Okay. Why? Because we're only looking at one trait. We're just looking at hair color. That's it. You can get more complicated and look at what's called a dihybrid cross, where you compare multiple different kinds of traits together all at the same time. But we're going to save that for next time, okay? This time, I just want you to learn the monohybrid cross, which is just trying to see the percent chance of what the kids could be, if we know that the alleles, or the variations of the trait that mom has and dad has, what the likelihood is that their kids will be one trait or the other, brown hair or blonde hair, okay? So remember, because brown hair is dominant, it's capital B. What's the percent chance that the kids would be brown hair? Well, it would be, these guys will be brown haired, so that's 25, and these kids would also be brown haired because the capital B is present, so it gets expressed. There is no capital B here, so this isn't brown hair, this is blonde hair. So there's a 75% chance, 25 plus 50, that the kid will be brown haired, okay? And there is a 25% chance that the kid will be blonde haired, all right? This is called their genotype. The genotype, is their letters, like big B, or big B, little b. But the phenotype is what it looks like. So remember, genotype is letters, and phenotype is visual, like brown for hair, brown hair, okay? So you need to know the difference between genotype and phenotype. When I say genotype, I mean the genes. I'm talking about the letters, the alleles, okay? Big B, little b, that's genotypes. But how it looks to you on the outside is the phenotype. How it is expressed visually on the outside is the phenotypes. Remember, physical phenotype. How it looks on your physical body, physical phenotype. Genetics, genotype. And that is everything you need to know for today about genes, genotypes, alleles, traits, and Punnett squares.